Hi, my name is Chester. I often go by the screen name Clam, and I have a pretty strong interest in how CPUs get the performance they do. And I'm also decently comfortable with low-level coding, so over the past years, I've written quite a few micro-benchmarks to poke around the CPU architecture. And I've also used that code to write articles on chips and cheese, so be sure to check that site out. Here, I'm doing something a bit different by talking a bit in video format, not writing an article, and I'm going to see how much performance I lose by disabling Zen 4's micro-op cache. So as a bit of an introduction, micro-op caches, or op caches for short, are caches. They keep data closer to the core because modern CPUs are very often bound in memory access performance. But unlike regular caches that hold the same bytes that you would see stored in system memory, but just closer to the core, micro-op caches hold internal micro-ops that correspond to instructions at cached addresses. Modern CPUs don't directly execute instructions. Rather, they take the instruction bytes, so that could be x86, that could be ARM64 instructions, and then they translate those into micro-ops that are understood by stages further down the pipeline. This translation process, or instruction decoding, consumes both power and adds latency, so it's attractive to skip instruction decoding whenever possible for both power and performance reasons. Zen 4 primarily does this with a large op cache that can hold nearly 7,000 micro-ops. This is a 12-way set associative structure with 64 sets and 9 micro-op lines, and it can deliver 9 micro-ops per cycle for likely by reading out a whole 9 micro-op line per cycle. So this cache has a lot of bandwidth and it has a lot of capacity. On the capacity side, for perspective, nearly 7,000 micro-ops, that's like, if you consider x86 on integer instructions, you have an average instruction length of maybe 3 to 4 bytes. So you have something like 28 kilobytes of capacity, nominal capacity. It's going to be less for efficiency reasons, but it's getting really close to that 32 kilobyte instruction cache with the conventional fetch and decode path. So of course, if you miss an op cache, Zen 4 can also feed itself by using that conventional fetch and decode path. That can handle up to 4 instructions per cycle. Usually one instruction decodes to 1 micro-op, so very often that is going to be very close to 4 micro-ops per cycle. And you can see how that's both significantly less than a micro-op cache. And after decoders and op cache, Zen 4 has a 6-wide rename and allocate stage that is responsible for allocating micro-ops to the backend. It also does register renaming and a batch of other optimizations. But anyway, this stage is 6-wide. And it's a narrow stage in Zen 4's pipeline. So Zen 4 is considered a 6-wide core. But you can also see, if you're feeding the core from the decoders, you very often won't be able to fill this stage up because that's 6-wide and you're very often getting 4 micro-ops per cycle from the decoders. Now, Zen 4 can also feed itself from another source, that is the loop buffer. That's actually a 144 entry micro-op queue sitting in front of the redeem and allocate stage. Zen 4 can lock that down for short loops and feed the core entirely from that and turn off both the decoders and the op cache to save power. So that's 3 sources that Zen 4 can feed the pipeline from. But the question is, what happens if it feeds itself entirely from that 4-wide decoder? So normally that would be hard to test, but thankfully, AMD has made that perhaps unintentionally easy to test. They've actually disabled the loop buffer through a BIOS update, or a GSA update, I should say. I don't know exactly when they did this, but when I updated my ASRock B650 motherboard to the latest version, well, that latest BIOS version, performance counters report no micro-ops delivered from the loop buffer. For the op cache, though, that's a bit harder, but thankfully, AMD Zenline has, well, what I would call in the software world a feature flag, what hardware designers probably call a chicken bit. Well, Zen 4 has one of those that can turn off the op cache. So I'm turning that off across all cores, and then I'm going to run tests and see exactly how much performance I lose. So to start, I'm going to look at SPEC CPU2017 to get a general idea of performance. SPEC is a sort of industry standard benchmark. System vendors often use it to advertise their systems, and hardware designers will often use instruction traces taken from SPEC to help tune their architectures, and they might use those traces to help project performance even before they've taped out a CPU. If I set that chicken bit to disable the op cache, SPEC CPU2017's integer suite sees a 12.5% score decrease, and a floating point suite sees a 6.6% decrease. Each of those suites is called a suite because it consists of about a dozen individual tests, and each of those tests has different characteristics, so it's worth looking a bit deeper. Within the integer suite, Exchange 2 stands out in particular because it sees a huge 33% performance decrease if you disable the op cache. It's the highest IPC workload in the integer suite with a 4.31 IPC average with the op cache on. So that's comfortably over the 4 instructions per cycle that the decoders can provide. Once you turn off the op cache, IPC drops to somewhere in the low 3 range. So that huge performance loss is pretty easy to understand. And to really drill down deeper into it, I've also collected more performance counter data. Each Zen 4 core has 6 performance monitoring counters and corresponding event select registers. One of those events that you can put into the select register, specifically that one with event code AA in hexadecimal, that measures ops dispatched from the front end to the back end, and you can use a unit mask to filter by source. So that source can be the loop buffer, it can be the op cache, it can be the decoders. I've also used count masking in the event select register. So what that does is you can set a count mask field to a non-zero value. If you set it to a 0 value, then it's pretty intuitive, right? You increment the counter by the number of ops delivered during that cycle, or more generally, how much the event increments by that cycle. If you set it to a non-zero value, like let's say I set it to 3, and I'm feeding the core from the decoders, and I have that event programmed with the event AA and unit mask for the decoders. If the decoders delivered 3 ops per cycle, and I have the count mask set to 3, then 3 is greater than or equal to 3. So it will increment by 1. Now, if it's less than 3, if it didn't deliver anything or delivered 1 op that cycle, then the counter will not increment, or it will increment by 0, basically. For the purposes of this, I want to see how many cycles each source was active. So I've set the count mask to 1. So it's counting how often the front end was feeding the back end using a particular source. If we drill down to Exchange 2 again, we can see that even with the op cache active, that op cache is busy feeding the core for over 86% of core cycles. Another issue is that in Exchange 2, the front end appears to not be used very efficiently. So normally, if you see the op cache busy for over 86.7% of the time, that's really weird, right? Because the op cache should have absolutely overkill bandwidth. Remember, it can deliver 9 microops per cycle. The rest of the core can only consume 6 microops per cycle. So it really should not be that busy. And what I think is happening is the front end is not being used very efficiently. Any cache, when you fetch from any cache, you're getting a block of data, and you may not use the whole thing. And what I think is happening is when you take a block and the instruction side, if you have a taken branch, you're not going to be able to use the rest of the block because your instruction stream has gone elsewhere. That requires another fetch. So there can obviously be other reasons why bandwidth is lower, but that's one factor. With Exchange 2, throughput from the decoders is actually down to like an average of 3.15 microops per cycle. That's still really good. You're using most of your decode slots most of the time, but because it's such a high IPC workload, it really shows through. But then if you look at X264, the decoders are active most of the time, but then they're pretty much running at maximum efficiency. You're almost never losing decoder slots to like taken branches or anything else, and that averages 3.98 microops per cycle. So that explains why among the high IPC workloads, Exchange 2 is really badly hit. It's able to push over the decoder throughput, partially because the core is not seeing any data cache side misses. That's why it's such a high IPC workload. Other bottlenecks that are usually present are not there. And because it's not using the front end very efficiently in the first place. So the front end has to work overtime because of the way this workload behaves. And to be very clear, I think this event, the AA and hexadecimal event, is actually measuring not when the microops come from the decoders or from the microop cache, but actually when they go from the front end to the rename and allocate stage. So that's an important distinction because if you let ops queue up in the microop queue, you can get more than 4 microops per cycle from a source like the decoders, even if that source by itself never delivers more than 4 microops per cycle. But I think that when you're really front-end bound, as is the case in Exchange 2, that counter is actually a pretty good approximation because you're more likely to have the microop queue empty most of the time. So the microops are going to use a bypass path to save latency. They'll go straight from decoders to the rename and allocate stage. And so by count masking and dividing the count by the number of cycles it's active, you get very close to average throughput for the decoders or for the op cache, for that matter. So going back, right, towards this whole suite, we are starting to see this pattern where very high IPC workloads can suffer quite heavily if you turn off the decoders. That's intuitive. If you take a core from 6 wide to 4 wide and you're bound by core width, you're going to lose some performance. But from the other end, there are workloads that are low IPC in the first place. OmnetPP suffers a lot of data side cache misses, so it's very bound by cache and memory access latency. MCF is another test. It's also bound by cache latency, but it's really more bound by front-end latency, like branching costs, branch mispredicts, and both of those don't lose much from having the op cache disabled. So you can see how if you lower front-end bandwidth, and you're not bound by front-end bandwidth in the first place, well, obviously, your losses are not going to be that great. And we see some of that too heading over to SPEC's floating point suite. That whole suite doesn't lose a lot of performance. Remember, that's like 6.6%-ish total. But even within that, there's some variation. Most of those are moderate, medium to like low to medium high IPC workloads. They don't get close to 4 IPC, and most of those don't see a loss. But 2 tests stand out here. There's InMagic, that averages 3.59 IPC, basically 3.6 IPC. And there's NAMD that averages 3.64 IPC. If you turn off the op cache, that makes InMagic's score drop by 13%, and NAMD takes a 20.76% loss, so both of them are outliers. It's not quite as bad as Exchange 2, but these are higher than average losses, and they hurt. And from the other side, of course, the same story of low IPC, it's the same story. So ROMs and Cat2b SSN, they are completely unaffected with the op cache off. And that's the case even though they have a very high op cache hit rate. So again, the trend is minimal to no impact in low IPC workloads, and generally worse impact high IPC ones. Another complication is that Zen 4 supports SMT, simultaneous multi-threading. So that means the core can track 2 logical thread contexts. And by thread, I actually mean like all the register state for a thread. General purpose registers, floating point registers, control registers, instruction pointer, right? So everything necessary to run a process. And to the operating system, it appears as 2 logical cores. Well, once the core gets 2 independent instruction streams, and by independent, I mean like these 2 threads did one instruction from one thread, generally cannot depend on instruction from another, except in like weird corner cases like sharing data. But anyway, that exposes a lot of parallelism to the core, and that will push per core IPC higher. And when you do that, you get closer to pushing the decoders to their limits. So if I run SPEC's rate test with 2 copies, pin both copies to the same physical core, then I can look at how SMT performance decreases with the op cache off. The integer suite in that case loses 16%. Remember, that's higher than 12-ish% from before. And the floating point suite loses 10.3%, which is a substantial increase from the 6.6-ish% decrease from before in single-threaded mode. And now we're getting right about to what you would expect for the performance difference between 2 consecutive generations of CPUs. So that's not a great performance situation, right? You can see how critical the op cache is, how critical front-end bandwidth is more generally to SMT performance. For one case I want to look at, Exchange 2, with SMT on, op cache on, 4.74 IPC per core if you have the op cache on. Well, if you turn the op cache on, these decoders are now busy for like 97% of cycles. They're really feeling the pressure. Performance loss is still in the 30% range, but now it's in the higher 30% range. On the floating point side, one particularly interesting example is LBM. In single-threaded mode, that's basically unscathed. You have like less than a 1% performance loss. With 2 threads in the core, it takes a 10% performance hit. So that's a massive difference from before. SMT brings it from 2.42 IPC with 1 copy to 3.28 IPC with 2 copies. So without the op cache, the decoders get very busy, and in some cases, you can struggle to feed a core that is not constrained by latency within a single thread. And as another example of a workload that doesn't see much impact, I want to head over a bit to gaming. Just one game. I don't have a lot of free time, unfortunately. So I'm looking at Cyberpunk 2077 and the built-in benchmark. Of course, there are more realistic ways to test gaming, but unfortunately, I don't have time when I'm running something many, many times. So here, unlike before I tested with the non-Vcache die on the 7950 X3D, here I'm testing with the Vcache die because that's more applicable to gaming. And to maximize consistency, because this affects the GPU as well, I'm capping my 6900 XT to 2 GHz for consistency, and I've turned off boost on all cores, so we're looking purely at performance per clock at 4.2 GHz. That is the base clock of the 7950 X3D. So with the op cache, I average about 154 frames per second with the built-in benchmark. Without the op cache, that drops to 153.45 frames per second. So that's less than a 1 frame per second drop. During the benchmark run, I also logged performance counters, and it This workload averages about 1.3 IPC per active core cycle. This is not really a high IPC workload by any means. It's not going to push like 3.5 IPC like some tests. It's not going to push over 4. So factors like back-end memory latency or front-end latency are decreasing performance, and the bottleneck has shifted away from front-end bandwidth, which is why turning the op cache on or off doesn't actually make a huge difference here. To conclude, Zen 4's op cache is absolutely critical for high IPC workloads, especially when a core has both SMT threads loaded. It's less important for medium to low IPC workloads, though very often in those cases it can still provide a performance gain, and it's definitely a great feature to have around. My overall impression is that Zen 4 does remarkably well with op cache disabled. There's an overall performance drop, of course, but even with that in mind, it's still a very strong core in an absolute sense, even without the op cache. In some workloads, there's no drop at all, and in the single game that I've tested, there was also a negligible performance drop. And I'm really surprised by this because compared to Intel's chips, and actually ARM's chips as well, AMD relatively leans harder on the op cache to maintain high instruction bandwidth. Intel usually pairs a wider decoder with a smaller op cache. For example, Golden Cove pairs a 4K entry op cache with a 6Y decoder, and ARM does something similar with Cortex-X. I think at least one of those has a 3000 entry micro-op cache and more than a 4Y decoder as well. AMD in Zen 4 and Zen 5 both has a larger op cache and a relatively less capable decoder. That carries forward if you compare Lion Cove and Zen 5 as well. But overall, even though AMD is leaning harder on the op cache, performance in absolute terms is still quite good with the op cache off. And Zen 4 is actually still really competitive against some mobile chips like Intel's Redwood Cove if you look at total spec scores. So even if Zen is completely forced to feed itself from a 4Y decoder, performance isn't that bad. And that really speaks to how strong the rest of the core is and how often the core is limited by factors other than core width, right? We're often not pushing anywhere close to the core's nominal width, and we are very often well below even the 4 IPC capabilities of the decoder. If you enjoyed this video, thank you very much for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, although I very likely won't have time to make a lot of videos like this.